So, hi, I'm Naz, an incoming graduate student at the University of Toronto interested in computing education. Today, I'll be presenting some of the work that I did with Professor Michael Lute last year. I'm super excited to be here and to be presenting this work with all of you. So I'd like to start this talk with a question. You might have been attending talks all week or have attended some today. How many of those talks do you remember? Do you think that having to explain what you saw to someone would increase the likelihood of you remembering the talk or understanding it more? Like, what if I just asked you to explain what you saw in this talk to me after I finish it? So this is what motivated the work that we'll be presenting today. Students have reported an inability to focus when learning online and generally show resistance to working on prep components in flipped classrooms, including doing readings and watching videos. There have also been studies which show that students try to game homework systems when they don't understand the material that they read or saw. So what we tried to do is add a pause after students watched prep videos and ask them to explain the concept that they just saw. Why? Again, we wanted to combat resistance, add structure and focus to their conceptual understanding, and add a level of self-regulation for them to understand any weaknesses in their conceptual understanding before they worked on questions. So in prior work, we've had some research on reflecting about concepts, though we mostly talk about reflection on experience. There's also been a growing body of research on teachable concepts and self-explanations. Now, a lot of this work has been done in engineering and nursing, though mostly experiential in engineering. And the closest work that we saw in the computer science space was done by Chen et al. On security concepts, where they prompted students to reflect on concepts in security and then surveyed students to see what their reactions were. Now, the research questions that we had were, firstly, and most importantly, does requiring students to reflect on concepts have positive effects on their performance immediately? So really, can we prevent gaming and encourage thinking about a concept more after they watch a video? And secondly, in the long term, does reflecting have a positive effect on their performance? And for this, our measure was looking at their grades on subsequent assessments. For our design, we added reflective prompts to a flipped classroom environment in an Introduction to Databases course, which is generally taken by third and fourth year students majoring in computer science. In the prep component of the course, students watched a video that explained a concept like base operators. They were then prompted to reflect on the concept and explain it. And lastly, they answered a few multiple choice questions on the concept. To see the impact of reflection, we divided the class into two groups. Group 1 reflected on a certain set of concepts like aggregation, and Group 2 reflected on a different set of concepts like join operations. And then there were topics that neither group reflected on. We had 220 students in total, and we divided it so that we had around 110 students in each group. Both groups watched the same videos, reflected on a concept in each week, though different concepts, and then answered the same questions after reflecting so that everyone had the same amount of work. This was done as the instructor did not want to risk certain students being a lot more advantaged than other students or having a lot more work to do than other students. And they answered the same question so we could assess the impact of reflecting versus not reflecting. For labs, we checked student performance on labs 3 and 4, which they worked on after they reflected on concepts covered by the lab. Labs did not have a control group, but we compared the performance of students who submitted reflections with those who did not submit reflections or were marked as students who did not submit a meaningful reflection. We described this more in the paper, but an example is people who just thrashed the keyboard or submitted song lyrics. because these weren't really reflections that we were looking for. Now, it should also be noted that Lab 4 covered additional topics that the students did not reflect on. For our first research question, we looked at how students performed on follow-up questions right after they reflected on a topic and checked the number of submissions that they needed to get an answer right. We should mention here that the homework system used gave them feedback immediately, so they knew if their answer was right or wrong as soon as they submitted. They could also submit as many times as they wanted to until they got the answer right before the deadline. Now, for our second research question, which wasn't our primary focus because we didn't have a control group, we checked student grades on subsequent assessments. In this case, the students had labs, which were essentially assignments for the course, and a lot greater in difficulty than the homework questions. So in our results, when we checked the number of submissions that students needed to get an answer right, we noticed that students who reflected on a topic took fewer submissions than students who did not reflect on a topic. It is worth mentioning here that the x-axis is the number of final submissions that we looked at, not the number of students, as we were looking at how many submissions a student took to get the answer right to each follow-up question. To look for significance, we performed the Mann-Whitney U-test, as we did not want to make assumptions about the underlying distributions. Finally, our key takeaways were that people who reflected needed fewer submissions to get the right answer on questions that assessed the topic that they reflected on. And people who reflected meaningfully by following the instructions we gave them appeared to get a better grade on subsequent assessments that checked the topic that they reflected on. I'd like to go back a few steps. Earlier in the presentation, I talked about how we wanted to combat resistance by adding reflections, but we saw that there were students who either did not reflect or submitted song lyrics or thrashed their keyboard. And there were quite a few students who did that. We had 41 students who submitted Lab 3 but did not submit a meaningful reflection, and 31 who submitted Lab 4 but did not submit a meaningful reflection. So while combating one form of resistance, we did find another form of resistance. Students may not want to engage in reflecting. Now, we do have some threats that we identify. Firstly, fewer submissions does not mean that students got an answer faster, but it does mean that they didn't try to submit many times and game the system. It may indicate that they took some time to understand the topic before submitting. But for all we know, they could have been checking on Google. Secondly, people who reflected and followed instructions could very likely just be high-performing students. So having an effective control group and seeing whether reflection has long-term effects is really still an area that can use future work. What we are currently working on is testing if providing students with different mediums to reflect has an impact on their performance. So we decided to repeat a similar experiment, but test using voice input for reflections and compare that with reflections done using text. We also want to examine student perspectives on reflection in this setting and see whether they report finding these useful. So here's a sneak peek of our analysis this year, where we tried to look at long-term retention using check-in topics after a few weeks, but we did this across condition groups. Again, this also goes on to show how many people don't reflect, despite the fact that we gave them another option to reflect. Finally, we'd like to end with a call to consider adding reflective prompts in an online learning environment to help students pause and understand a topic. There is scope for future work in retention and seeing whether there are specific topics that adding reflection can be more impactful for, because it is a time-consuming task. There is also scope to see when a pause can be added, as prior work suggests that adding a pause too early may not be best for self-regulating, as it is too early to identify weaknesses. We welcome any other ideas or systems to help with this area of study. Thank you.